All right. Welcome, everybody, to another installment of Reader Meets Writer here with Siba. I'm coming to you live from my mother's guest room in Oak Island, North Carolina. We had a little bit of a hurricane down here on the east coast of North Carolina, but things are settling now. But apparently you can go home again to a very beach-themed guest bedroom at my mom's house. But tonight is a great event, and I will get to our two authors that are going to be in conversation together in just a moment. But first, I want to thank you all for coming and joining this event. It is put on by the Southern Independent Bookseller Alliance. This is an organization that represents almost 700 bookstores throughout the Southeast, and these are specifically independently owned bookstores. So perhaps one of those bookstores invited you tonight. If you love hearing about Odie's book tonight, we encourage you to please purchase his book or Chanelle's book from one of the bookstores that invited you tonight. Our independent bookstores are the lifeblood of our literary communities. They are the heartbeats of our civic mindedness, so please support them with everything you can. I want to give a special shout out tonight to Parnassus Books, which is Odie's home bookstore there in Nashville, Tennessee. There are signed books available from that bookstore, and Odie will stop in and personalize a book for you if you so choose. And I want to also let y'all know that we have some great events coming up next week. Tuesday, August 11th at 5 p.m. will be with Kim Powers, who has a new book out called Rules for Being Dead. And on Thursday, August 13th, we have National Book Award winner Sarah M. Broom, author of The Yellow House. We have some killer events next week. So please find your way to be invited to those as well. But I want to talk about tonight's event. We have a very special event tonight as well. We have two authors joining us. We're featuring Odie Lindsey's new book, but in conversation with Odie is Chanelle Benz. And I'll tell you a little bit about her. Chanelle Benz's story collection, The Man Who Shot Out My Eye Is Dead, was published in 2017. It was named the best book of 2017 by the San Francisco Chronicle and was shortlisted for all kinds of stuff, including the Penn Robert W. Bingham Prize and the Story Prize. Her novel, The Gone Dead, was published in 2019. It was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and a Tonight Show Summer Reads finalist. It was longlisted for the Penn Hemingway Award for debut novel, the Center for Fiction, and she currently lives in Memphis, Tennessee, and teaches at Rhodes College. She will be in conversation with Odie Lindsey tonight, celebrating his new book, Some Go Home. Odie is also the author of the story collection, We Come to Our Senses. Both books are from Norton. We Come to Our Senses was included in the Best of 2016 list by Electric Literature and the Military Times. And the New York Times Book Review noted that it captures our culture now. His fiction has appeared in the Best American Short Stories, the IRE Review, Guernica, 14 Hills, Electric Literature, and all kinds of places. He's had residencies at the Center for Creative Arts, the Virginia Center for Creative Arts, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and he is the writer in residence at Vanderbilt University's Center for Medicine, Health, and Society. And so I want to welcome both of them here with us tonight and turn it over to them. And I want to encourage y'all, if you have questions tonight for Odie or for Chanelle, make sure you share them in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. And when you type in your question, please, please, please give a shout out to your home bookstore. Give us your name and your home bookstore, and I'll make sure that Odie gets your question. So I want to introduce Chanelle and Odie.
Thank you so much, Wiley. Given that introduction of Chanelle's work and the caliber of the work, we know now why I asked her if she would do this before she had the chance to read my book. She said, okay, well, what can I do? I put down that novel and I thought I need to figure out how to rope this person into this. I'm so glad that you're here, Wiley. I'm glad that you're here. Siba, thank you. I'm a former bookseller at Square Books. That's my sort of literary home place in Oxford, Mississippi, and love visiting bookshops. So yeah, this is a joy. You'll see that I talk way too much, but I'm going to try to pause and go from there. Thanks.
Thanks, Odie. It's a pleasure to be here. It was a joy to read your book. There's so many things I want to talk to you about. Did you first want to read from the book?
Yes, yes. And by the way, this is the book. Some go home. It's amazing. Looking at it, I'm transfixed. It's so beautiful. I just stare at this thing and then realize, oh wait, no, I need to also read. I'm going to read just briefly from it, and to give you a background and what we'll sort of, I hope, speak a bit about. The book is, it follows several different families in a small North Mississippi community, a fictional town called Pitchland. And it speaks to this notion of trauma and their past and how everyone has sort of been impacted by a particular event, and how the different ways in which they've tried to almost run away from it. But the necessity to kind of reckon with the past in order to move on. And in particular, the main character is named Colleen. I've written about her. She's in my story collection. She's a young Iraq War veteran. She's been home for 4 or 5 years at the start of the novel, though it does go back and forth over the course of really about 40 years. But this is just a brief bit. All you need to know, I think, is that Colleen's husband is Derby. And just when she thinks she's sort of run far enough away from her personal trauma, Derby's elderly father, his name is Harold, or Herr Hobbs, he's brought back in. He's going to be retried for a civil rights era murder that he was acquitted of back in the 60s. So I'll just stop there. Oh, by the way, she's pregnant. That also helps. Colleen woke the next day to the bleat of the phone on the stuff-cluttered bedside table. She pawed at the pillows. Answer that, babe? Derb? His side of the bed was empty, meaning that he probably left for work. When the phone quit ringing, Colleen sank back into sleep until it rang again. She groaned, reached over, and clicked on the cordless. Hello? Speak to Derby, a woman asked. Her voice was young, yet nicked. Colleen sat upright. Hello, the woman asked again. You there? Yeah, Colleen answered. Derb's, he's already gone. You know who this is, right? Colleen stood up, paced through the house, and looked out the front windows. Derby's pickup was parked at the far edge of the property where the long dirt drive met the two-lane county road. He was blocked in by a white news van, a TV truck emblazoned with the local affiliate logo. She watched her husband confront a reporter and his cameraman. You hear me, the woman groused. Yeah, Colleen said. I know who you are. She went outside and began to jog down the dirt driveway, barefoot, her body heaving. She couldn't yell for Derby, lest the caller find out he was still at home. Instead, she waved her free hand in the air and tried to get his attention. But he was too busy telling the reporter off. Within seconds, the news crew had loaded up and pulled away. Derby hopped in his pickup and peeled out behind him onto the paved road. At least give me his cell number or something, the woman barked. Shit. Colleen stopped in her tracks, all but out of breath. Winnie, she gasped, you know better than to call this house. Derb doesn't want anything to do with you or for sure your daddy. Well, maybe it's mutual, Colleen, but here's the thing. He doesn't have a choice anymore. Hare's back in jail and headed back to trial. They booked him this morning. Say there's evidence of jury tampering from way back, so now everybody's going to be coming after everybody else. Lawyers, feds, media. There are men out there you and I don't even want to think about, Colleen. The type Derby and me grew up around. So he can either deal with me or deal with them. By subpoena or muscle, he will be a part of this deal. Colleen hadn't felt threatened since deployment. She blushed. So I'll just stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Odie. That was great. So one of the things I want to start by asking you about is what I feel is the currency of the book, which is place. And so it's what these characters orbit, it's what they trade in, it's what they try to escape and they obsess over, place. There are some scenes in Chicago, which is a notable destination for the Great Migration, but the book centers on the small Mississippi town of Pitchland, which is your own fictional creation, and the contested Wallace House, which is an antebellum manor, and the famous giant magnolia tree, and you'll have to correct me if I'm saying this right, Belle Arbor? How would I say it? French accent?
Let's just go with that. I think, I like the idea that it's a sort of constructed space, so interpretation is open. Yeah.
So one of the details that I love about this invention is that we find out that the real manor burned down in the Civil War, and that actually this, antebellum manor, which is at the center of town, was actually brought over in 1965 as part of the centennial for the Civil War. And so the book is capturing and gesturing to these little hairline fractures in the mythology of the Deep South. And so even as you're getting presented these things, you're also getting presented what's kind of behind the facade and the kind of presentation that is asking to be preserved. And so as I looked at all these intricacies that you created about Pitchland, I wondered, what was your process for creating it?
Sure, great. And yes, place is a tremendous part of this. I worked on this book for so many years, and if someone says start describing it, as I'll try to do, I just spin out about place as much as people. And it is set in a fictional North Mississippi town, Pitchland. I lived in Oxford for a while, but I guess in terms of the practical nature, everything from sort of drawing road maps or sketching things to, more importantly, driving around and catching glimpses of different particular sort of dramas that maybe weren't exclusive to these tiny towns, but in order to make this town, which I wanted to be almost hyper local and hyper dramatized, I put this collage together. And for instance, you might go to Holly Springs, Mississippi, and you would see these sort of antebellum manors next to Rhodes College, this extraordinary place that is now part of its campus is sort of this shell. Or you would see this pop culture spot called Graceland 2 that was painted pink, and this is a offensive structure right adjacent to these other sort of valued Southern homes. You would go to, in Oxford, certainly the collision of Oxford's history, but also with undergraduates and with, football, but the literary community and the arts history produced its own little dramas. And so really would snatch that. And it's funny, in Oxford, before I was able enough to admit that I had grown of age where I needed glasses, I remember one day walking and I saw the biggest magnolia tree I'd ever seen. And when I got close, it was about 7 of them that were in a copse together. But from that, for instance, I said, okay, what if it were this great magnolia tree, this thing that's so tired about sort of some Southern literature, myth, the myth of the magnolia. I'm going to make it bigger. I'm going to make it the biggest one in the history of the South and see how that happens. So it really was this composition of all these little bits. It has so much to do with land and with the way that we grow in relationship to land. I think is when it comes to Colleen, for her, she's been extracted from this place. And maybe we'll speak about that because she was sort of a driving force for me, but she comes back and, she's been sent halfway around the world. She's been globalized. She's deployed. She's been all over media. She's done all of this stuff and she comes back and nothing changes. And so part of that place has to do with how that culture happens, what goes into making that. And then as far as the myth, of course, the myth of sort of Southernness in particular, I would say Southern, if I'm thinking about my audience, sort of white identity, but certainly, you define one body and you're defining a lot of bodies. And I think this idea of this place that was antebellum was one type of design, Italianate, and then it was ruined and then it was rebuilt as something else. And then it was rechristened something else. And then the house actually is trucked into town in 1965 and plopped on this parkland, but everybody treats it as if has been there since time immemorial. And so I wanted to consider how we bestow value on spaces, how we bestow that. And Colleen gets into that. This event had happened technically on this piece of land. So her family and herself and who she is and her community all relate to their relationship to this property. And really the property is a hybrid. Little details are wrong. Again, it was trucked in 65. It is in league with this sort of mythical narrative, this continuancy, but it wouldn't make sense to any architect, just like making sense of these narratives. When you look closely, it's like, that's pretty problematic and wiggly at best, even though it can be so volatile. So I really wanted to get into that notion of place and authenticity and myth and how we define that, or how it defines us maybe.
Yeah, I thought that it was very timely given all that's been happening with memorials and this idea of asking, when was this erected? Right? Was it during Brown versus Board of Education in 1955? Was it right after the Civil War during Reconstruction when Black people were able to vote? You know, was it who brought it in? Was it the Daughters of the United Confederacy? So I thought it was really notable that a lot of these things that had been created in Pitchland were also kind of responding to these events. So you mentioned Colleen, and the book is a series of alternating third person and alternating perspectives that interrupt and carry the narrative forward and backwards sometimes. But central is Colleen's perspective. And she's a female vet, as you said. She's home from the Iraq War. She's struggling to find her place with drinking, with drugs, with not feeling exceptional, as she puts it, anymore. So how did I know that she appeared in one of your stories from your collection, but how did her character, her complex, fierce character, enter the novel and become so central? And then how did you figure out how to connect her story? Because she has a different connection to the Wallace House and other people, to all these other voices, because they span race, they span class, they span generations. So how did you I kind of imagine you with this like red strings kind of thing connecting all these characters. So how did you do that?
Sure. The red strings. Yeah, you're exactly right. I'll start maybe with the most basic, and that is to draw on my own deployment. And this was some time ago. It was the first Gulf War. And I, when I got home from that, immediately, I was sort of bestowed or sort of endowed with this elevated status, right? It sort of slotted in as I was, for lack of a better term, more of a man in terms of sort of, heteronormative guy and this and that. And it bothered me because it felt false and it didn't feel sort of correct. And also it felt sort of frivolous at times, or, it was complicated. I ran away from that for years, many, many years. And then when I began writing or trying to write about that, and this was really with the onset of the Iraq War in 2002, 2003, I realized that maybe the chasm there had to do with the fact that there was this ready-made narrative for one type of body. And I would say particular, though not exclusive to the South, there was this ready-made narrative, and it had been put on me. And yet it's been so present with me that I couldn't even remember the people I served with. My own war memory excluded tons of different bodies and tons of different folks that have been forever a part of this process. And I thought, what is that? Why is that? Why is it that even my own memory is going to betray who I think of as a soldier? And when I close my eyes, it's this one type of body, and that body is a lot like mine. That led to me thinking about people with whom I'd served, thinking about folks like Colleen, and sort of writing that and trying to find that connection with her. Now, as to how she ended up in this novel, she shoved her way in. She was not going to be a part of it. The main narrative was one of the other through lines about a Chicago widower who inherits this historic home and is sort of a Chicago-based guy who comes down to Mississippi and is fish out of water. But what I found was I kept thinking about Colleen. She's from this little town. Who is she in 5 years? Would she have a family? Would she heal from some trauma? How would people treat her? Also along the way, when I was reading from that story and had this work sort of in process, I had what a gift it was to often meet with female veterans or just other people who'd read the story and who were saying, you're doing, we're glad for this work. And it was heartening because I know that it's a big leap for me out to even attempt. I don't know that this is my story to tell, but I wanted to keep telling about her. But in order to do that, I needed to look again at that culture. What made her feel this way? What made me feel this way? How did the South, how did this culture contribute almost to like a war, post-war situation? Because while Colleen's trauma drives her, really she comes to find out that it's this community's relationship that's going to kind of define her. And once I was there, and once I started thinking about, in this case, this murder, civil rights era murder, and I had done a lot of scholarly work there, and I had worked on the Mississippi Encyclopedia for about 10 years, which was hundreds of scholars contributing to this, and started to looking at these sort of intersections, and that's really how I wanted to look at it, intersections of course, of class, race, gender, and then I needed to shift from Colleen's perspective to other perspectives. I wanted to make a mosaic because it couldn't be a one-liner. And just to harken back to this notion of place, you know, it's all too easy to make a one-liner out of, oh, wow, there's a small Mississippi town and guess what? This racist, violent thing happened. And there's nothing wrong. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but I think sometimes that's a little bit too easy. And for Colleen and for maybe the South and for maybe this event, it needed to be more than a one-liner. And so I wanted to look at different perspectives, different families, how everybody might have benefited even and or been shut out even of the narrative. That's a very long answer. Yes, we're going to just stop me there. But
well,
yeah,
I think it's interesting
and I couldn't not address her. So.
Yeah, it's interesting because she brings in a few things, like who gets to heal in this space and who doesn't, because I feel like some characters get to and some don't. Who gets to be a patriot and who doesn't? Who gets to process their trauma and who has to kind of just keep it burrowing through their lives? And she's kind of fighting for all those things. So I thought it was interesting that she's so central. So you referenced the civil rights era murder, and one of the looming events in the book is the kind of mystery around the retrial of Hare Hobbs, who's a white aging World War II vet for the 1964 murder of Gabe, who is a Black farmhand and also landowner who was working on the Wallace farm or the Wallace land. And so when I was reading about Hare's character, I felt like you wove so many historical things in there, and I was kind of amazed at how many things you were able to bring up. But so it brings up, you know, the Deep South love affair for conspiracy theories, the myth of the lost cause, the Southern strategy, the whole connection between elite whites in these rural Mississippi towns, getting lower class whites who may or may not be affiliated with the Klan to do their kind of brutal, dirty work, and sort of keep their noses clean, or white citizen council types. And so I could go on and on and on, but I'm curious about the research that went into this, but also the inspiration that went into creating Hare's character, because I think you were able to avoid that kind of one-liner, as you said, and really complicate him, make him complex, but at the same time, make him still feel the pull of these kind of long embedded forces.
Sure. Yeah. Again, trying to move beyond just this easy narrative. I don't think these narratives are easy. I don't think they're supposed to be. And so I really wanted to emphasize that. I worked on this project. It was just the best gig you could ever have, an encyclopedia of the state of Mississippi that I didn't have to write, but I was receiving sort of hundreds of scholarly articles. And meanwhile, I had done some research and lived on the planet and everything else, and you start seeing, of course, these sort of continuums and these circular events. And I think that you allude to this phrase that happens in the book, but it's been around forever, rich man's war, poor man's fight. And these complications often of race and class that have driven conflict, right? And we could see it, Civil War, we certainly could see it post-Reconstruction, we could see it Jim Crow, you could see it Civil Rights era, which I've spent a lot of time just being educated as best I could about that. And as a veteran, it's phenomenal to consider this sort of mobilization and massive resistance and you know, just the intensity of this, that because of my age, I was born only a few years after. I was born in 1971. But it still was a removed sort of history. So it was sort of fascinating to get into that. And yet to be around any of us as flawed people, I really wanted to give all of these characters complexity, some depth. I mean, this is an elderly person who did serve in a war, who was squeezed by notions of race and by class, who also has a lot of really despicable characteristics, as well as being somebody who cans vegetables every year, who's a grandfather, a great grandfather. And so just as with the town, which, by the way, I mean, it's at once hyper local, but I wanted to weave in history that connect it to really a national or international scope. We forget that Mississippi, not only, you know, we were indigenous, and then you had Spanish and Brits, and French and creolization of Africans, the entire, so really tremendous cultures here, global cultures. So I wanted to weave that into this tiny constricted space, right? If there was a way to do both of those things, make it hyper local, but also resonate on a larger scale, that was the goal. That brings, in terms of hair being complex and the model, maybe, I'm afraid to say this, and everybody, you already know that I yap too much and that I say like not the smartest things in the book. But if I had to look at a literary guidepost, I really think, and it always, that for me, how do I frame this? I'm gonna start tiny or big. I'm gonna start big. If I were to say that Toni Morrison is the sky, right? She's the sky. And I hope that sometime the best paragraph that I ever write or book I'll ever write will be the crummiest little paper airplane that might like be framed against that sky before crashing horribly. And my point being is she would do that, right? She would take characters that, despite the fact that they might be these sort of despicable people, quote unquote, or have, and make them, by and large, human or tremendous or complicated. And that's even what I wanted to do. I mean, how easy. I can mention old white guy racist from Mississippi. And you know what? Yeah, like, I'm not going to curse here, but we're done with that. We need to be if we're not. But that's also in literature in particular, in this book, and there's a person. I need to make him a person. Yes. So yeah. Shut me up.
Well, one thing that I thought was interesting is he's a World War II veteran, and for a while that carries some cachet, but so is the black farmhand that he's accused of murdering.
Correct.
And that is a very different homecoming. Like a black, the black World War II veterans come back and they've had this other experience where they've been treated differently in Europe and other places, and they come back expecting to feel like patriots, but they're still treated like second-class citizens. And they also come back to violence. Like there's always a spike in lynching after every war, or every world war. And so I thought it was really interesting that a lot of Hare's yearnings were very similar to his. And so there's this way that they could have sort of they are in conversation with each other. They just don't know it. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I think, thanks for bringing that up. That's a tremendous part, again, about sort of the veteran identity, who is, who isn't. When you look at not just the South, but nationally, post-World War I, you had this dramatic spike, as you mentioned, not only in lynchings, but just in what we might term sort of just everyday violence. And if you were African-American, exponentially, you were more than likely to be the target of violence on the street, on the bus, wherever, than if you were not. Post-World War II, same thing. And in fact, when we look at, civil rights, you had so many veterans who sort of double victory, war, victory abroad, victory at home, were taking up positions of authority with whether it was the NAACP or other folks, but that makes you a target. Whereas one person could put on this uniform, such as myself, let's say, later on, and be endowed or bestowed with this really wonderful, I think often well-intentioned sort of meaning. Somebody else puts on that uniform and they become a target and they become a threat. And so both of these men are veterans, and they both have relationships to identity which are different, but again, yeah, they're in dialogue, and they may never even know it. I really wanted to explore that. Yeah.
So I don't want to neglect the kind of acute, evocative, beautiful language that the book has, especially when describing the land. So there's a line, Mississippi, we hide how gorgeous it is. And I was thinking about that, and there are lines that talk about how gorgeous it is. So in the book, a tornado is a symphony of violence, marked by cracked pines and tail clouds and the pop of the roadside transformer in concussive blue-white light. I love that, concussive blue-white light. And the sheen of the sun becomes the light praising everything into a polarized sort of crispness. And so the way that the book talks about the land, the way that the characters have this connection, we mentioned it earlier, but, what are their relationship to the land? As in, why do people stay in this poverty-stricken little Mississippi town, or why do they return? And what's the difference, do you feel, between those that stay and those that leave because of, the Great Migration, or because of the mechanization of farming, of big ag? You know what I mean? There aren't jobs. So what is the difference between those who stay or return and then those who go?
Sure, and thank you so much for reading that. Everyone here's like, wait, could we now get rid of the bald guy? Craft-wise, in terms of that language, I'm so grateful that you pointed that out. It's funny, sometimes it was just me, and you won't believe this, but I yap a lot. I tend to write the same way, and I needed to contract something. I had an entire chapter about a tornado that was going to come and impact the lives of Colleen and her husband. And it was pointed out to me that you really need to figure out how to cut that down. And so I thought, damn it, I've got to make this count. And so that description became the chapter down in a sentence or whatever, because I really needed it to be there. As for why people come and go, I mean, first of all, it's not easy. Again, speaking about intersections of everything from class, basic economy, the idea of the ability to move sometimes, and great migration, yeah, for sure, but also on the Chicago end of things, it wasn't always as welcoming there, or as sort of streamlined as was thought. Certainly there was tremendous benefit, but then you have reverse migration later on, often because of economy or because of race or things like that. But really think about it, who we are. We've invested a lot of time. Gabe's family for years on this small farm. And again, he's an African-American landowner on this small farm, this little island around this, as I say, I think ocean of Wallace, which is this white landowning family. And that's been passed down and down. I mean, why should this guy leave? I mean, there are a million reasons why he might, but damn it, like, that's his. He built this place as much as anybody else. And, there's a stubbornness that has to do with the war. Maybe there's a legitimacy that has to do with having it handed down. Maybe there's this notion of family in place that, again, like, he believes should co-define things. I think he feels like, I can ride this out, and land here is such a prominent issue. Land binds Colleen to somewhere across the planet. Land binds all of these bodies to this particular little town. And I think Gabe sort of feels like, this is mine. It's been passed on. I'm going to wait this thing out, or just, damn it, you're not going to tell me when to go. I'm going to go when I decide. Now, that's in the context of this novel. And I think, of course, it drives him because ownership and land ownership and aesthetics here of what's quote unquote valuable really impact how these characters interact. But often what we do, and the people that we are around, and the ways that we're raised, and the complications at hand there are what decorated. I mean, everybody has their relationship to land. The one driving thing I'll say that's hard, and it ended up sort of being the title of the novel for Colleen, is this idea that people there are telling her who she should be. And that's really difficult. Her small town, or whether it's a large town, whatever, is dictating, you're this kind of person, you're going to act this way. This is the type of, in this case, woman that you're going to be. And so if she, and potentially Gabe or anyone else, can get past that idea of someone telling them how and who they're going to be, damn it, they can stay there or not, but by their own design, no one else's. Yeah.
So really quickly, were there any non-literary influences on the book, music, art, a certain town or place?
I think, yeah, a couple of things. One, I used to go down, before I ever moved there, years before, I would go down to Otha Turner's. He had a picnic for 50 years, really, in Gravel Springs, and he was a fife player, and he had a fife and drum outfit, and that made its way into the space itself, because it was extraordinary. And the title is taken from an old country singer, Jerry Jeff Walker song, 1970, and in the middle, I just ripped him off, so I'm going to acknowledge him now. There's one line that says, it's about a woman going home, and it says she's headed home, back where life begins and ends, and they feel that you belong to them. And that song used to mean a lot to me because I was a soldier, and it starts out with a soldier coming back to Tennessee, but then right in the middle is this line about people telling you who you're supposed to be, and I said, I've got to. So yeah, so it's on the cover. It's on the cover that I'm doing this.
Well, thank you so much, Chanelle, and thank you, Odie. That was so interesting. It gave us such a good idea of what the book is about, and the beauty inside it, and all the complications of, reflecting these struggles that these characters have. Before I ask a question of my own, we've got a couple of questions lined up. I want to encourage our viewers to please, if you have questions, share them in the chat box. I'll feed them to Odie. Mention your name and your home bookstore. But Odie, I've got a question for you, and I was going to ask you this before we jumped on and went live. So now I'll ask it in front of everybody, since I didn't get a chance to ask it before everybody got on. Can you talk about how your work in the classroom, trauma, the body, healing? How does what you're reading and what you're talking about in the classroom go into a book like this?
Well, at the Center for Medicine, Health, and Society at Vanderbilt, I'm so lucky to be a part of it. Most of my colleagues are across sociology, anthropology. They're doing just tremendous work. But basically, one focus is on the body and on the idea of social determinants or health, or which bodies we might inhabit contribute to health, well-being, or not. And so for my part of the vehicle, really, I get the glory of sort of reading literature and asking these students who are most often pre-med, something like that, to read literature as if they would, looking at these bodies, looking at complications of how different bodies are exhibiting sort of health or not. And that's, so I fit in this way. One great thing is they're phenomenal. I mean, these are extraordinary students. They don't often know how to read literature, so it's great. So I forced them to engage. Let's say again, if we're going to read Toni Morrison or Jesmond Ward or Larry Brown or somebody, we're going to pull apart not just what it says, not just the book report, but think about how these bodies are living, how they're engaging with each other, what the culture and social components are that dictate who they are. And then they're going to bring in studies that might have to do with gender, race, ethnicity, sexuality, class, and how these things might impact those bodies. And so it's this really cool dialogue. I learned so much from them, and then get to really teach them to look at books and literature in this way that most of them, again, hadn't thought about. So it's a blast.
That sounds fascinating. And a couple of folks were like, thanks for asking the question I was going to ask. But I've got another selfish question before I get to the other people's questions. You mentioned Jesmond Ward and Larry Brown stacking up the Mississippi writers. Yeah, that's right. Being a Mississippi writer is a big burden to shoulder. How do you feel not taking that on, but like, falling into that stream? Do you feel pressure? Do you feel a reckoning? Do you feel a path has been blazed? How does it feel? Especially coming from Oxford, having a background at Square Books, knowing all those people,
right,
I'm sure.
Right. It's all one great compliment, honestly. I realized with writing this book or writing these stories, I wanted to find out how to write. I wanted to find a different way into a story, but I realized, look, I can't chase that. It's too big. But what I can do is consider some of this work and some of the writers I adore and some who I've just thought about forever and ever. Some I love so much, it's the third time I mentioned Toni Morrison. I won't even read all of her books because I don't want to accept that they stop, right? So, but thinking about how those stories are constructed or how they speak to things, it's tremendous. And it makes you try to punch as best you can above your weight. And I'm sure that all of us who write do that same thing. I mean, it's like, I have got to try, and charge the steepest hill possible and likely fall down on it. But that's got to be the way. Yeah. So in Mississippi certainly speaks to that.
Yeah, when I think about Mississippi writers, being from North Carolina, I joke that North Carolina is an interesting state because it's North Carolina against North Carolina because we're such a divided state. Right. But in Mississippi, it's Mississippi against the world. Yeah. It's just like, come to Mississippi, bring it to us. It's a state that's so proud of its writers and its resonance as well, and it's overcoming. We got a question here from Stephanie, Copperfish Books. I think she's probably referencing your tie to land and your tie to place. Where were you living when you wrote this book? And how was your maybe not being in Mississippi affecting that?
So I started it when I was in Oxford and working on that encyclopedia. And then for several circumstances, I went to Austin, Texas for a couple of years, which was great. It was necessary. I think sometimes I either fall too in love with a place or too frustrated with a place, or it's just too close. So I went to Austin in a, how do I easily phrase this? This is going to be a sidebar, but it'll come back. One great thing, quote unquote, about being a veteran is you have healthcare, and therefore you can often pursue jobs that aren't dependent upon it, and or you can pursue jobs wherever you want. So I went from Austin, actually, I took a year working online and editing online, and I went to rural Italy, and then I went to Spain, and then I went to Morocco. And then when I ran out of money, somebody in Nashville called and said, "Are you still writing? Because I need somebody to write something." It's going to Nashville. So it was a great string of places, but really it also, I think, enabled me. I had moved, by the way, before Mississippi, was Chicago, which is a big part of this book. So I think it enabled me to both get that really local situation, but also reflect globally and think about connections. People are warring over land, people warring over identity or bodies all over the place. So it really was a cool way to think about Mississippi while being both there and away from it.
Cool. Well, we got one more question that just came in. I don't want to leave it out. Doreen asked, do you feel like a Mississippi writer? You write so beautifully about the South, and your first book took place in a few locations. What part of the South do you feel like you embody the most? Doreen slipped that question in right at the deadline, so I have to let you answer it. And she said, who do you envision you're speaking to when you're writing?
Well, on this book, okay, well, as far as a Mississippi writer, I don't think they would let me be one, but out of love. I think it's one of those places, and my childhood was in Texas, and man, it's a whole thing. I got there 6 weeks late, and they were like, "You're not." So I think in general, it's the Southeast, I think, is my audience. But again, I want to reach out to larger spaces, this notion of Chicago, this notion of push-pull. Chanelle mentioned at the onset, even this Italianate house, the one that I was picturing, was designed by the guy who was partnered with Frederick Law Olmsted. We see these connections that are woven throughout the book. Now, who I was writing for, just to be straightforward, was often, I think, my fellow Southerners who, maybe while I'm writing the book, hopefully it's different now, were not as interested in addressing on straight ahead sort of narratives about bodies and about who we are that we should be addressing, namely race and namely white Southerners. Now, I think it's interesting now, or I hope now, I don't know how to read it now. That actually, if I say Confederate monuments, a hell of a lot more people are talking about that. A bunch of bodies didn't need to be that to be mentioned for a whole lot of time, but that was the audience here. It was mostly, I think, sort of a white, maybe progressive or other audience say, hey, who are we? These are problems. We need to look at how place and personality and identity come together and are complicated, and we can't ever go forward unless we're going to look and try to reckon with that.
I love that. Let's reckon. Yeah, pick up Odie's new book, Odie Lindsey's new book, and let's reckon with that past and with what we want the South to be, which is a resonant message here for an event put together by SIBA. And thank you, Chanelle, so much for being in conversation with Odie. So if you're interested in purchasing his new book or one of Chanelle's books, please consider dancing with the one that sent you the invitation tonight. And if you have not received an invitation for next week's events, we have Kim Powers and his new book, Rules for Being Dead, Tuesday, August 11th at 5. And then we have the National Book Award winner, The Yellow House, and Sarah M. Broom, Thursday at 7. Please find a way to get on the list to get your bookstore interested in these events. We have had a ton of them. They are always well attended, and we always have a blast, and we always hear from such interesting and well-spoken authors like we did tonight. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you to Odie and to Chanelle for being with us tonight. And please support your local independent bookstore. And we'll see you next time for Reader Meets Writer.